British musketry regulations from 1909 set the standard: 15 rounds on target at 300 yards in 60 seconds. The minimum requirement for a trained rifleman with the Lee-Enfield. Not a sprint, not a demonstration. Standard training. The rifle had to reload twice during that minute using 5-round stripper clips pulled from the pouch. Well-trained soldiers could fire 20 to 30 rounds. Sergeant Major Jesse Wallingford hit the target 36 times in 1908. That record stood through both World Wars. At the Battle of Mons in 1914, German infantry reportedly believed they were facing massed machine guns. They weren't. They were facing British regulars with Lee-Enfield rifles on rapid fire. By 1941, the British had refined that rifle into the No. 4. Simplified for mass production, built to arm an empire at war. At the same time, American soldiers were getting the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that represented the future of infantry weapons. Today we break down the comparison behind the Lee-Enfield No. 4 and the M1 Garand. Let's begin. The Lee-Enfield No. 4 and the M1 Garand came from completely different philosophies. The Americans wanted innovation, the British needed production. Both got what they were after, but the road to 1941 looked nothing alike. John Cantius Garand was born in Quebec in 1888. By 1919, he was working at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, tasked with creating America's first standard-issue semi-automatic rifle. It took him 15 years. The design went through multiple iterations. The T1E1 failed because the bolt was too weak. The T1E2 got a redesigned bolt and became the foundation. On August 3, 1933, the rifle was officially designated the U.S. Semi-Automatic Rifle, caliber .30 M1. But adoption and production are different things. The first production M1 didn't finish testing until July 21, 1937. Deliveries to the Army began in September that year. By Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the U.S. had produced fewer than 600,000 M1 rifles. Many units still carried the M1903 Springfield bolt action. The Garand was cutting edge, but ramping up was slow. The British took a different path. They already had a proven rifle. The short magazine Lee-Enfield, or SMLE, had served since 1907. It fought through the entire First World War. Soldiers loved it. The bolt was fast. The 10-round magazine was double what the Germans had. But by the 1920s, the British War Office knew they needed something easier to mass-produce with better sights. Development of the No. 4 began in 1918. The first trials rifle, the No. 1 Mark V, came in 1922. It featured an aperture sight mounted on the receiver instead of the old barrel-mounted notch. The design evolved through the Mark VI in the 1930s before becoming the No. 4 Mark I. The rifle was officially adopted on November 15, 1939, just 2 months after war broke out. But adoption and widespread issue are different things. Production didn't ramp up until 1941. New factories at Royal Ordnance Fusiliers and ROF Maltby started producing rifles that year. Birmingham Small Arms opened a facility at Shirley. By 1942, British domestic production hit 600,000 rifles per year. The No. 4 was simplified for mass production. 2-groove barrels replaced 5-groove. Cheaper materials went into furniture. A simpler 2-position flip sight replaced the micrometer sight on early models. The British were in survival mode in 1941 and 1942, and the rifle reflected that. In early 1941, before America entered the war, the British contracted with Savage Arms in Massachusetts to produce 200,000 No. 4 rifles. Canada's Long Branch Arsenal near Toronto started production the same year. By the end of the war, Long Branch made over 900,000 rifles. Savage made over 1 million. All were interchangeable with British-made No. 4s. The key difference, the Garand was designed from the ground up as a semi-automatic. The No. 4 was an evolution of a bolt action refined over decades. One was revolutionary, the other was pragmatic. Both would go to war in the hands of millions. A design born from necessity, proven in combat. Strip these rifles down and you see the difference immediately. The M1 Garand was complex. The Lee-Enfield No. 4 was simple. Both worked, but the engineering told you everything about the armies that built them. The Garand was a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle. It weighed 9.5 pounds unloaded. With a full 8-round clip, sling and bayonet, it hit 11.2 pounds. The barrel was 24 inches. Overall length was 43.5 inches. It fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge, 7.62 by 63 millimeters, one of the most powerful service rounds of the war. Here's how it worked. When you fired, high-pressure gas from the bullet traveled down the barrel. Near the muzzle, a small port tapped off some of that gas. The gas drove back a piston that formed the end of the operating rod. The operating rod ran from the muzzle all the way back to the bolt. It twisted and pulled the bolt back, ejecting the spent case. A spring in the operating rod returned everything forward, chambering the next round. Smooth, fast, semi-automatic. The magazine was internal and held 8 rounds loaded via an N-block clip. You pushed the clip down from the top. It seated with a click. When the last round fired, the clip ejected automatically with a distinctive metallic ping. That ping became iconic. There's a myth that German soldiers listened for it to know when a GI was out of ammo. Soldiers who were there said that's nonsense. In combat, nobody's hearing anything over gunfire and explosions. The sights were outstanding. The M1 had a precision aperture rear sight mounted on the receiver with elevation adjustments out to 1,200 yards. The front sight was a hooded post. American ordnance got the sights right. German reports from the field specifically noted how much better Garand sights were compared to their own Kar 98K. Rate of fire for a trained soldier was around 30 aimed rounds per minute. The rifle was accurate out to 500 yards in practical terms. Maximum effective range was listed at 457 meters. Soldiers reported the Garand kicked less than the Springfield, despite firing the same round. That's because the gas system absorbed some recoil. The No. 4 was simpler in every way. It weighed about 9 pounds unloaded. Length was 44.5 inches with a 25-inch barrel. It fired the .303 British cartridge, 7.7 by 56 millimeters. Not quite as powerful as the .30-06, but still a full-power rifle round. The bolt action used rear-locking lugs and cocked-on closing. That meant the bolt stroke was short and smooth, faster than any other standard bolt-action rifle of the war. A trained British soldier could fire 15 to 20 aimed rounds per minute. Some claimed more. The magazine held 10 rounds, loaded from the top with 2 5-round stripper clips. Unlike the Garand, you could top off the magazine any time without ejecting the clip. The sights were effective. Early No. 4 rifles had a micrometer aperture sight adjustable out to 1,300 yards. Wartime simplified models used a 2-position flip sight set for 300 yards and 600 yards. That's all most soldiers needed. Aperture sights were faster to acquire than notch sights, and the sight radius was longer than on the old SMLE. The barrel on the No. 4 was heavy and free-floated for most of its length. The last 2 inches of the muzzle were exposed. A spike bayonet attached directly to the barrel. Soldiers called it the pig sticker. Later versions got a bladed bayonet, but the spike was cheaper and faster to produce. In terms of raw firepower, the Garand had the edge. Semi-automatic meant follow-up shots came faster. But the No. 4 wasn't far behind with a good rifleman. The 10-round magazine versus 8 gave the British soldier an advantage in sustained fire before reloading. The 30-06 hit harder and flatter than the 303, but both were lethal at combat ranges. The Garand was more complex. More parts meant more things that could break, but when properly maintained, it was reliable. Veterans from Normandy to the Pacific said so. The number 4 was simpler, easier to maintain, easier to produce, less likely to malfunction because there was less to go wrong. One veteran from the 82nd Airborne said his M1 got soaked on the jump into Normandy. It worked fine. He cleaned it the next day during a lull to make sure it kept working. During the Battle of the Bulge in freezing conditions, he cleaned it every chance he got. It never failed him. British soldiers said similar things about the number 4. The rifle worked in mud, dust, cold, and heat. The smooth bolt action rarely jammed. Even when the rifle was filthy, you could still work the bolt. Theory is one thing, combat is another. Both rifles went to war in every theatre from 1941 to 1945. The real test came under fire. The number 4 saw its first major combat in North Africa. British and Commonwealth forces used it at El Alamein in October 1942. The rifle performed well in desert conditions. Sand and dust were constant problems, but soldiers reported the number 4 held up better than earlier rifles because of the exposed muzzle and simplified design. The rifle went with British forces into Sicily and up the Italian peninsula in 1943. The M1 Garand arrived in North Africa with American forces in November 1942 during Operation Torch. Many units still carried the M1903 Springfield, but the Garand was becoming standard. Early reports were positive. An observer report from Army Ground Forces dated March 5, 1943, noted that soldiers who had the M1 were satisfied with it. The semi-automatic rate of fire made a difference in close engagements. D-Day on June 6, 1944, put both rifles into the biggest test of the war. American paratroopers jumped into Normandy with M1 Garands. One veteran from the 508 Parachute Infantry Regiment said he didn't use a weapon case. He pushed the rifle between his harness and his body and jumped with it. He landed in water. The rifle got soaked but worked fine. He carried as many extra bandoliers of ammo as he could because the commander told them to. He was glad he did. His group fought behind enemy lines for 5 days before he was wounded. British and Canadian forces landed on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches with number 4 rifles. The weapon performed well in the hedgerow fighting that followed. The bocage terrain of Normandy was brutal, short-range engagements, limited visibility. Both rifles worked, but the Garand's semi-automatic capability gave American infantry an edge in quick firefights. By late summer 1944, American NCOs and officers who had been carrying M1 carbines started swapping them for Garands. The 30-06 round could punch through doors, masonry, and heavy brush. The carbine couldn't. In urban combat and woods fighting, the full-power rifle mattered. The number 4 remained the standard British rifle through the liberation of France, Belgium, and into Germany. British soldiers didn't have a semi-automatic option. The number 4 was what they had, and they made it work. The 10-round magazine meant fewer reloads. The fast bolt action kept them in the fight. The M1 Garand went to war in the Pacific from day one. Marines and Army infantry carried it at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The jungle was hell on weapons. Humidity, mud, constant moisture. Soldiers had to clean their rifles every day, but the M1 held up. Veterans said it worked even when covered in filth. The 30-06 round proved critical in the Pacific. It could blast through thick jungle undergrowth. Japanese soldiers often fought from fortified positions or dense vegetation. The power of the Garand mattered. By mid-1944, many Marines who had been issued M1 carbines were trading them for Garands. The carbine didn't have the punch to cut through jungle, or penetrate cover. The Garand did. The No. 4 saw limited use in the Pacific. British and Commonwealth forces used it in Burma, Malaya, and other operations. The rifle worked fine in jungle conditions. The smooth action and simpler design meant it was easy to keep running. But the British didn't have the industrial capacity to equip every unit with new rifles, so older SMLE No. 1 rifles remained common in some theaters. Here's the truth. The M1 Garand gave American infantry a firepower advantage. Semi-automatic fire meant faster follow-up shots. That mattered in combat. General Patton wasn't wrong when he called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. American soldiers outgunned their opponents in most engagements. But the Lee-Enfield No. 4 was no slouch. A skilled British rifleman could put rounds down range almost as fast as a Garand. The 10-round magazine gave British soldiers 2 extra rounds before reloading. The rifle was simpler, cheaper, and just as reliable. British infantry held their own throughout the war. Both rifles had weaknesses. The Garand's N-block clip system meant you couldn't top off the magazine. Once you started a clip, you were committed. The No. 4 required manual operation of the bolt. That's slower than semi-automatic, no matter how fast you are. Rifles don't fight wars, soldiers do, but the weapons they carry shape how they fight. American and British infantry doctrine reflected their rifles. The U.S. Army built its infantry tactics around the individual rifleman. Every soldier was trained as a marksman. The M1 Garand was central to that philosophy. American infantry squads in World War II consisted of 12 men. The squad leader and assistant squad leader carried M1 Garands. 2 scouts carried M1 Garands. The automatic rifleman carried a Browning automatic rifle. The assistant automatic rifleman carried an M1 Garand. 5 riflemen carried M1 Garands. 1 soldier carried an M1 Garand and served as ammunition bearer. That's a lot of firepower. In a firefight, an American squad could put out sustained semi-automatic fire from multiple positions. The bar provided suppressive fire. The M1 rifles provided accuracy and volume. The doctrine emphasized fire and maneuver. Squads moved in bounds, one element providing covering fire while the other advanced. The M1 Garand made that doctrine work. Semi-automatic fire meant soldiers could engage targets without breaking their sight picture to work a bolt. That's faster, more accurate, more deadly. American infantry training emphasized marksmanship. Soldiers spent weeks on the range learning to shoot. The M1's sights made precision easier. The British built their infantry tactics around the section, which was 10 men. The section was divided into a rifle group and a Bren gun group. The rifle group consisted of a corporal and 4 riflemen, all armed with No. 4 rifles. The Bren gun group consisted of a lance corporal, a Bren gunner, and 3 riflemen with No. 4 rifles. British doctrine emphasized fire and movement, but the Bren gun was the center of the section's firepower. The rifle group provided security and flanking fire. The Bren gun group provided suppressive fire. In an assault, the Bren laid down covering fire while the rifle group advanced. Then the rifle group provided covering fire while the Bren group moved. The No. 4 rifle fit this doctrine perfectly. British soldiers were trained to fire rapidly and accurately. The fast bolt action and 10-round magazine supported sustained fire during advances. The rifle was reliable enough to work in any conditions the section encountered. British training emphasized fieldcraft and fire discipline. Soldiers learned to move, take cover, and engage targets methodically. The No. 4 was a tool for that kind of fighting. It didn't waste ammunition. It didn't overheat. It just worked. American doctrine put more firepower in the hands of individual soldiers. The M1 Garand supported aggressive, fast-moving tactics. American squads could lay down heavy fire and maneuver quickly. That worked well in France and Germany, where terrain allowed for movement. British doctrine relied more on the section working as a unit. The No. 4 supported disciplined, coordinated fire and movement. British infantry fought methodically, using cover and the Bren gun to suppress while riflemen advanced. That worked well in all theatres. Neither doctrine was better. They reflected different approaches. The Americans had the industrial capacity to equip every soldier with a semi-automatic rifle. The British didn't. The No. 4 was what they could produce in the quantities needed. British soldiers made it work through training and discipline. One interesting note: British Royal Marine Commandos used M1 Garands in Korea when they fought alongside the US Marines. They loved the rifle. When Commonwealth forces stood up their own units later in the war, the Marines weren't happy about transitioning back to the No. 4. Once they tasted the Garand, they wanted to keep it. That tells you something. Fire superiority decided everything. Battles are won with bullets and barrels. Production numbers and logistics mattered as much as design. Springfield Armory began mass production of the M1 in 1937. Production was slow at first. By 1940, Springfield was producing around 100 rifles per day. As war approached, production ramped up. By Pearl Harbor, Springfield had delivered around 600,000 M1 rifles to the military. In 1940, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company was contracted to produce M1 Garands. Winchester built a new factory and produced over 500,000 rifles by war's end. Springfield Armory remained the primary producer. By the end of World War II, total production exceeded 4 million M1 rifles. Springfield made about 3.5 million. Winchester made the rest. The rifle was expensive to produce, lots of machining, tight tolerances, complex parts. Each rifle required skilled labor and time, but the US had the industrial capacity. The factories ran 3 shifts. Women made up 43% of the Springfield Armory workforce by the war's end. They were called WOWs, Women Ordnance Workers. They worked every job from heavy forging to stockmaking. Ammunition was another story. The .30-06 cartridge was already in production for the M1903 Springfield and the M1919 Browning machine gun. The US produced billions of rounds during the war. Supply was never an issue. American soldiers carried bandoliers of 8-round clips. Resupply was constant. British production of the No. 4 started in 1941 at 3 new factories: ROF Fazakerley in Lancashire, ROF Maltby in Yorkshire, BSA Shirley in Birmingham. By 1942, these factories were producing 600,000 rifles per year. Total British wartime production reached around 2 million rifles. But that wasn't enough. Britain was fighting a global war and needed millions of rifles. North American production filled the gap. Long Branch Arsenal in Canada began production in 1941. By 1945, Long Branch had produced over 900,000 rifles. At peak production, they made 28,500 rifles per month. Savage Arms in Massachusetts produced over 1 million No. 4 rifles under contract to Britain and later under Lend-Lease. Savage-made rifles were marked U.S. property on the receiver. All North American rifles were built to the No. 4 Mark I standard, which used a simplified bolt release. That change made production faster. The No. 4 was cheaper and faster to produce than the M1 Garand. Fewer machining operations, simpler parts. Stamped metal replaced some forgings. Wartime rifles had cruder fit and finish, but they worked. Britain was in a fight for survival. Pretty didn't matter. Ammunition was produced in massive quantities. The .303 British cartridge had been in production since the 1890s. British and Commonwealth factories turned out billions of rounds. Soldiers carried pouches with stripper clips. Resupply worked the same as for the Americans. American logistics was superior across the board. The US had untouched industrial capacity, vast resources, and a functioning supply chain. M1 Garands and ammunition reached the front lines consistently. Broken rifles were replaced, parts were available, the system worked. British logistics were strained. Britain was bombed throughout the war, factories were damaged, resources were limited. The number 4 had to be simpler because Britain couldn't afford complexity. But the rifle reached the troops. North American production kept Commonwealth forces equipped. One advantage the number 4 had was parts commonality. British rifles from different factories were largely interchangeable. A rifle made at Fazakerley could use parts from a rifle made at Long Branch. That simplified field repairs. The Garand had good parts commonality too, but the rifle was more complex. Field armorers needed more training, more spare parts, more tools. The US had the resources to make it work. For Britain, the simpler number 4 was the right choice. The system held the line. Wars end. Rifles don't. Both the M1 Garand and the Lee-Enfield No. 4 lived long after 1945. The Garand remained the standard US service rifle after the war. It served through the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. American soldiers carried it at Incheon and the Chosun Reservoir. The rifle performed just as well in Korea as it did in World War II. Cold weather tested everything, but the M1 held up. In 1957, the US adopted the M14 rifle. The M14 was essentially an improved M1 Garand with a detachable 20-round magazine and selective fire capability. John Garand had helped develop it before his retirement in 1953. The M14 replaced the M1 Garand as the standard service rifle. But the changeover took years. Some units used the M1 into the early 1960s. The rifle remained in service with Reserve and National Guard units into the 1970s. The Garand was exported to dozens of countries. NATO allies received thousands through military aid programs. Greece, Turkey, South Korea, Italy, Japan, and the Philippines all used the M1. Many are still in service with honor guards and ceremonial units. The M1 became a legend. General Patton's quote stuck, "The greatest battle implement ever devised." That's how the rifle is remembered. For American veterans, the Garand was the weapon that won the war. For collectors and shooters today, it's one of the most respected military rifles ever made. The number 4 remained the British standard rifle after the war. It served in Malaya, Kenya, Korea, and other conflicts through the 1950s. British soldiers carried it during the Korean War, fighting alongside Americans with M1 Garands. The number 4 performed well, but British troops who got to use Garands preferred them. That firepower advantage mattered. In 1954, Britain adopted the L1A1 SLR, the British version of the Belgian FNFAL. The L1A1 was chambered in 7.62 by 51mm NATO and was semi-automatic. It replaced the number 4 as the standard infantry rifle. The changeover took years. Some British units used the number 4 into the early 1960s. But the rifle didn't disappear. A version of the number 4, converted to 7.62mm NATO and designated the L42A1, served as the British sniper rifle until the 1990s. The rifle's accuracy and reliability made it ideal for that role. British snipers used it in Northern Ireland, the Falklands, and the Gulf War. The number 4 was exported widely. Commonwealth nations like India, Pakistan, and Australia used it for decades. Many developing nations received number 4 rifles as military aid. The rifle saw combat in dozens of conflicts through the Cold War and beyond. In the 1980s, Soviet forces in Afghanistan faced Afghan fighters armed with Lee-Enfield rifles. Some were number 4s and some were older models. All still worked. Today, the Lee-Enfield No. 4 is remembered as one of the best bolt-action battle rifles ever made. British veterans respected it. The rifle was reliable, accurate, and tough. For a bolt-action rifle designed in the 1920s and refined in the 1930s, it held its own against more modern weapons. The M1 Garand was the better rifle in most ways. Semi-automatic fire, better sights, harder-hitting cartridge, more modern design. American soldiers had a firepower advantage because of it. But the Lee-Enfield No. 4 was the right rifle for Britain. It was cheaper, easier to produce, simpler to maintain. Just as reliable. British soldiers made it work through skill and discipline. The rifle served for decades because it was good enough. Neither rifle was perfect. Both had weaknesses. But both were effective tools for the armies that carried them. They shaped infantry combat in World War II and beyond. That's the legacy, and that's the real reason these two rifles shaped the battlefield of the 20th century. So here's the question. If you were equipping an infantry force in 1944, which rifle would you choose? The semi-automatic M1 Garand with its firepower advantage, or the reliable, high-capacity Lee-Enfield No. 4 with its proven track record? Let me know in the comments. Next on the channel, I'll break down into the Bren gun, a light machine gun that shaped how British infantry fought in World War II. If that era and this weapon interest you, you don't want to miss it.